I was assigned to a hatchet force at MACV-SOG's Forward Operating Base 1 in mid-May 1968. John Allen was my platoon sergeant. 2 weeks earlier, he had been the lone survivor of a tragic recon mission in Laos. It was the talk of the FOB. One night we were having a couple of drinks. Make that a few drinks, and he told me about it. I'd like to thank SOG historian John Plaster for help with some of the details here. You may want to get yourself a drink. This is one hell of a story. On December 23, 1967, President Lyndon Johnson visited South Vietnam. Touting the success of the past year, he decorated his generals and assured the American people that the military situation was well under control. The celebratory mood did not last long. Just 29 days later, the North Vietnamese launched an artillery attack on the remote Quai Son Marine Combat Base. Over the next 77 days, the base would be pounded with more than 16,000 artillery shells. On January the 31st, the enemy simultaneously attacked over 100 South Vietnamese provincial capitals and hamlets. Although most were quickly put down, the bloody battle for the old Imperial Capitol of Hue lasted throughout the month of February. 2 regiments from the Viet Cong main force entered the city, while 3 regiments from the North Vietnamese Regular Army acted as a blocking force. As the battle finally drew to a close, the Viet Cong units in the city were decimated, while the North Vietnamese regiments melted away into the countryside. By the middle of April, the base at Quai Son had been relieved. Recalled to Washington, General Westmoreland faced one simple question. How the hell did the enemy mass thousands of troops and thousands of tons of supplies to launch the devastating attacks without detection? He offered no satisfactory answer. On the 19th of April, elements of the 1st Air Cavalry and the 101st Airborne Divisions entered the northern end of the Ashish Valley in pursuit of the retreating North Vietnamese. Although there were bloody skirmishes and a large amount of enemy supplies were captured, it quickly became obvious that the bulk of the North Vietnamese forces had made their way across the border into Laos. But where in Laos? For the answer to that question, the military turned to the elite commandos of MACV-SOG. On 3 May 1968, Recon Team Alabama, commanded by Staff Sergeant John Allen, his assistant Spec 5 Ken Cryon, and radio operator Paul King, along with 6 Nung mercenaries, boarded an H-34 King B helicopter at SOG's forward operating base in Phu Bai and headed west. Equipped with a wiretap device, their mission, defined as critical, was nothing less than to locate the North Vietnamese regiments that had attacked Hue and eluded the conventional American forces in northern I Corps. The team was inserted in Laos, west of the Ashish Valley. With no sign of enemy activity on the landing zone, they radioed at Team OK and requested Covey confirm their location. With that completed, they began carefully moving downhill as Covey departed the area. Within an hour, they had crossed a couple of well-worn high-speed trails and became wary. Putting the team in a defensive position, Sergeant Allen and 1 Nung carefully moved forward. They passed what appeared to be an abandoned mountain yard structure. At this point, with no sign of the enemy, Allen would have normally returned to his team, but knowing the importance of the mission, he pressed on, determining that if he didn't find anything shortly, they would return and search in another direction. As the ground flattened out, they came to a clearing, hidden below the thick jungle canopy. Carefully staying concealed, they moved around its perimeter and observed a substantial building. Soldiers and civilians were moving about. As Allen began photographing, he saw a large cave or tunnel entrance in the side of the hill beyond the building. The clearing stretched well beyond his field of vision. The movement of troops clearly indicated that they had found the missing North Vietnamese regiments. Knowing it was imperative to get this information to headquarters immediately, they quietly returned to the team's position. Cryan reported that they had heard several NVA troops as they passed by. Allen told King to contact Covey on the radio. When that failed, Allen directed the team to move laterally across the hillside to put some distance between the team and the enemy. They moved out stealthily, but they quickly heard shouting and sounds of the enemy breaking through the jungle. Allen picked up the pace and turned uphill. Now they heard the enemy shouting from their flanks and rear. Recon Team Alabama was clearly compromised. They broke into a run, hoping to return to their original LZ and contact Covey for air support and extraction. As they crossed a wide trail, they came under fire. Cryan was hit in the thigh and couldn't stand. One Nung was killed. Still under fire, Allen carried Cryan off the trail and continued uphill. The Nung secured their fallen comrade. Slowed by their casualties, Allen desperately looked for a spot they could defend, while King tried to raise Covey. 50 meters on, they came upon a large bomb crater blown into the side of the mountain. The blast had been sufficient enough to provide a field of fire on the downslope. The team piled in. The bomb crater was deep, close to 8 feet. The explosion had created a berm around its perimeter, except for a steep washout on the back side. It was quiet as the enemy struggled to determine their location. King evaluated Cryan's wound. The bullet had broken and displaced his femur. He bandaged it, applied a tourniquet, and administered morphine. Then he set about trying to contact Covey. With Cryan in no shape to be moved, Allen had the Nungs strip grenades and M79 rounds from their web gear and stack them in the dirt on the side of the berm. Minutes later, they heard the enemy cautiously moving into the open area. Realizing discovery was imminent, the team engaged them with rifle and grenade fire, causing casualties and driving them back into the tree line. Then it became quiet. Occasionally, a few rounds were fired at the bomb crater. The team carefully kept their heads down and conserved ammo. The enemy sent a runner to their base camp to announce that they had found the Americans. Over the next hour, NVA troops filtered into the area as King continued trying to make radio contact. Finally, he announced he had Covey. Allen took over the radio, and King moved up to the berm, looked over, and was instantly killed with a single shot. As he moved his body, Allen gave Covey a quick sitrep, which now included 2 KIAs. Within minutes, fighter aircraft were stacked up over the target. 500-pound bombs and cannon fire raked the terrain as the enemy sought shelter in holes and at the base of large trees. With their fire suppressed, Covey ordered a Huey to pick up the team. The pilot objected, saying he could still see troops moving near the bomb crater. Allen desperately called for his team's extraction. Covey directed an A-1E Skyraider to put napalm on the target. The drop was tight, almost too tight, but it did the job. Allen could see the enemy that survived running from the area. The Huey was inbound. The team prepared for the difficult task of lifting the bodies and the wounded Cryan out of the bomb crater. As the helicopter approached, it took some small arms fire and aborted the pickup. Allen stared in disbelief as he listened to Covey scream at the pilot to return. But he refused. It became eerily quiet. Then Covey began directing more airstrikes. The assets were getting low on fuel and ordnance. Light was fading. Finally, Allen got the inevitable message. Covey had to return to base. He'd be back at first light. In a tunnel nearby, the local NVA commanders met. They were dismayed to learn that the SOG team was still on the ground. Their mission was to provide safety, food, and medical care for the regiments transiting west. Now they would have to face the Americans and their air power again in the morning. They had an understrength anti-aircraft battalion. A full company of the Special Task Force had already arrived. Known as the Trung Son Commandos, they were specially trained to hunt down and kill SOG teams. The question was, did they have enough facilities to protect the regiments in caves, tunnels, and bunkers from air attack? If not, they would have to allow the Americans to be extracted unopposed. As the sun went down, The North Vietnamese tended to their dead and wounded. Sitting in a pitch-black bomb crater, surrounded by hundreds of enemy soldiers, thinking about dying is not productive. After tending to Cryan, Allen went over the rules of defense with his nungs. Although the enemy could clearly see the team's location during the day, it's easy to become disoriented at night. Therefore, they would refrain from firing their weapons as long as possible, because the muzzle flashes would allow the enemy to pinpoint their position. Instead, they would attempt to keep the enemy at bay with hand grenades and M79 rounds. Trusting the darkness for concealment, Allen crawled over the berm and placed 4 claymore mines. They waited, straining to hear any sound of an approaching enemy. The night sounds of the jungle, usually ignored, became almost unbearably loud. Allen tossed a grenade in the direction of the sound. It developed into a pattern, spaced almost an hour apart. With no screams of pain or covering fire to retrieve wounded comrades, Allen thought the enemy was probably throwing rocks. But probably doesn't keep you alive, so he continued to toss grenades. A few hundred meters away, the enemy was busy. In anticipation of the airstrikes that would surely come in the morning, they carried 12.7mm machine guns through the jungle and placed them as best they could in the darkness. Further out, trucks towed the more deadly 37mm anti-aircraft artillery into position. The enemy raked the berm of the crater with machine gun fire. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded around the team. Fearing an all-out attack, the Nungs responded with hand grenades, and Allen lofted 40mm high-explosive rounds into the enemy positions with his sawed-off M79 grenade launcher. It ended as quickly as it started. Dawn was approaching. Taking off from Udorn, Thailand, the Airborne Battlefield Command and Control Center C-130 aircraft, call sign Hillsborough, came on station a little after 0600 hours. Tasked with monitoring and allocating fighter aircraft operations over South Vietnam and Laos, they had been briefed on the planned extraction of RT Alabama from west of the Ashish Valley in Laos. The SOG Covey Rider from FOB-1 and the O2 pilot stood in the dark on the airfield runway at Phu Bai, drinking coffee. At first light, now only minutes away, they would fly directly to Alabama's location. The Covey Rider wondered if any of the team had survived. At Nakhon Phanom Air Base, 2 pilots climbed into the cockpits of their Sky Raiders. The heavily armed, propeller-driven planes flew low and slow over their targets, enabling them to accurately put ordnance on the enemy. Both pilots had supported Alabama the previous day. They knew the situation. By pushing their airspeed without burning too much fuel, they would reach the target area in about 50 minutes. Surrounding the team, the North Vietnamese were ready. 1 regiment had been placed in tunnels, the remainder had been moved to a deep ravine 3 kilometers to the west for protection against the expected air assault. Anti-aircraft weapons and ammunition were in place. Tasked to eliminate the SOG team, the Tran Son commandos received their final briefing. As the sun rose, all of the elements swung into motion. At first light, Allen injected Chiron with morphine. Then he and the 5 remaining Nungs braced for attack. Less than 50 meters away, the enemy moved into position. Their plan was a straightforward infantry assault. As simple as it was lethal, rocket-propelled grenades would initiate the attack. 2 machine guns on their flanks would rake the berm of the bomb crater, keeping the team pinned down. 2 squads would move right up the middle, being careful to stay below the machine gun fire. When they neared the berm, they would throw hand grenades into the crater. The explosions would signal the machine gunners to cease fire. Then they would rush the bomb crater. eliminate the team, and quickly return to their deep foxholes before the air power arrived. As seconds drug into minutes, they waited for the attack to begin, like soldiers in any army, wondering what the hell the holdup was. In the bomb crater, Alan clutched a radio handset to his ear, waiting for Covey. He had just about convinced himself that the enemy was going to take the morning off when the firing began. It was suicide to look over the berm. All they could do was wait with their rifles. Hand grenades fell into the bomb crater. They threw them back. Then the enemy appeared. Just feet apart, the exchange of automatic weapons fire was short and violent. No one had a chance to change a magazine. In desperation, Alan dove, grabbed the clacker, and blew a claymore. The firing stopped. A jet screamed overhead. Covey was on the radio. Just minutes too late. 4 Nungs had been killed, leaving just Alan, 1 Nung, and the wounded Cryan alive. Alan became an observer at his own rescue as Covey began directing the fighters stacked up by Hillsborough. As an F-4 Phantom swept in low for a strafing run, the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns opened up. A 37mm shell hit the plane. The unsuspecting pilots ejected moments before the jet exploded. Changing their tactics, the fighters pounded the area with cluster munitions and 500-pound bombs. The Sky Raiders arrived and began dueling with the 12.7mm machine guns and protecting Alan in the crater. Covey and the rescue helicopters were getting low on fuel. Turning the air control duties over to a Sky Raider pilot, they returned to Vietnam. The pounding continued with a relay of freshly armed aircraft until Covey returned. By that time, much of the ground fire had been suppressed. Hillsborough had a heavily armored Jolly Green Giant search and rescue helicopter on station and informed Covey it would hover over the bomb crater, lower its jungle penetrator, and wrench the team aboard. But there was a problem, a big problem. Due to what was called weight and altitude limitations, it could only pick up 2 men. After a heated exchange, Covey relayed the information to Alan. It made no sense. The jungle penetrator is built for 3, Alan argued. And it did not make sense, unless the big helicopter had already picked up the pilots of the downed F-4. But like many things in war, the explanation is lost in history. Alan had a decision: evacuate the wounded Cryan and keep the Nung with him for additional firepower, or stay on the ground alone. He chose the latter. With the Jolly Green hovering above and the Sky Raiders lighting up the ground around them, Alan lashed Cryan to the penetrator. The Nung climbed on and snap-linked himself to Cryan. Signaling the crew chief, the helicopter began to rise. As the men cleared the berm, the enemy unleashed a volley of small arms fire, killing them both. Alan dropped to his knees, screaming profanities. At this point, Alan grabbed my arm, I'll never forget it, and told me he had to get out of that bomb crater. It's not like he had a plan, he explained. He just couldn't stay there. He told Covey, and Covey told him to stay put. He refused. Just drop the stuff right on top of me, he said. Covey sent a couple of Spads, what we called the Sky Raiders, in hot. Alan sought protection between his fallen comrades. A jet blew by, loud and fast, as a diversion. Alan got rid of his web gear, grabbed the radio and a couple of fresh magazines, and crawled down the wash in the rear of the bomb crater. Then he broke into a run for maybe 100 meters and came to a halt. There was no reason to think the enemy was looking for him. Leaving someone behind in a bomb crater would seem as ridiculous to the NVA as it did to Alan. He started to move again and immediately came upon an enemy soldier. Fearing his shots exposed him, he broke into a run. A jet was overhead. A well-camouflaged 12.7, just meters away, fired at the plane. Alan quickly eliminated the unsuspecting crew and continued on. Checking his compass, he guessed his location from the bomb crater and requested an airstrike. It was surprisingly accurate. He kept moving, requesting airstrikes. Finally, things seemed to calm down. Alan found a protected area open to the sky and contacted Covey. His location was identified. Air power worked the surrounding area. With the familiar call of King Be Go, a Vietnamese H-34 swooped in for the pickup. Covey tried to call him off, but it was too late. The helicopter was hit, caught fire, and exploded, killing all aboard. Up and moving, calling for more airstrikes, Allen continued until Covey informed him that a Huey was inbound to pull him with a McGuire rig. As the slick approached, it took fire, limped over the ridgeline, and crashed. The crew was later rescued. Sometimes you stay alive because you're lucky. That happened for Allen in the bomb crater. Physical prowess and weapons proficiency help, but the men of SOG's secret skill was that they were born with minds that never stopped working. Although he couldn't see more than 30 meters in any direction, Allen visualized the situation. The anti-aircraft guns were positioned on the ridgelines, making rescue attempts suicide. He would have to climb to survive. Heading uphill, he changed tactics and called in airstrikes behind him, lower down, hoping to divert the enemy. Exhausted now, wishing he had more ammo, wishing he had more water, he kept moving. For 2 hours he climbed, finally over the top. Confident the mountain shielded him from the anti-aircraft guns, he called Covey. 15 minutes later, a King Bee swooped in and picked him up. Not a shot was fired. It would be fitting here to tell you that as a result of Recon Team Alabama's tremendous sacrifice, the 3 NVA regiments were destroyed. But like so much of the Vietnam War, that would probably be a lie. What we can say is that they accomplished their mission. God bless these brave men. You will find my book Dawson's War worthwhile. Rather than just accounts of MACV-SOG's various missions, Dawson's War is the story of 5 men, 3 Americans and 2 Brew Mountain Yard mercenaries. I'll take you with us for a year. You'll get your fair share of gunfights in Laos, because we did. But SOG was so much more than gunfights. SOG was a brotherhood, and unless you experience the camaraderie we shared, you can't really know SOG. Through Dawson's War, these 5 men will become your friends, and like we do, you'll miss them when it's over. In the end, you'll be able to answer SOG's most asked question: what kind of men ran these dangerous missions? Get a copy today at Amazon. Thanks.